The billionaire's funeral was supposed to be over in 10 minutes. His son had already been told exactly what to say, where to stand, and when to lower his head. But when the coffin was about to be buried, an old cemetery janitor suddenly stepped forward and whispered 6 words into the young man's ear. "Your father told me to wait." The son froze. Then he looked at the coffin. And for the first time that morning, he stopped crying. Because the janitor handed him a sealed envelope with his name on it. And written beneath his name were the words, "Do not open until he is dead." The young man stared at the envelope. His father was already inside the coffin. So why had someone instructed him to open a letter only after his father's death? And why did the janitor know something about his father that even the family lawyer didn't know? Before the envelope is opened, you need to understand one thing. For 20 years, that janitor had been visiting the same grave every morning. Not his wife's grave, not his child's, and not even the billionaire's. He had been visiting a grave that officially belonged to a man who was still alive. If you think you know where this story is going, wait until you discover what was hidden beneath that grave. Subscribe to Hidden Motives, because the truth behind this funeral is far darker and far more personal than anyone in that cemetery could have imagined. The funeral of Daniel Whitmore had attracted nearly 200 people. Daniel had been one of the richest men in the country. His companies owned hotels, apartment buildings, technology firms, and private investment groups. To the public, he was a ruthless businessman who had built an empire through discipline and determination. But to his only son, Ethan, he was simply Dad. Or at least, that was what Ethan had believed. The funeral was being held at an exclusive private cemetery on the edge of the city. Rain fell gently against black umbrellas as family members gathered around the polished coffin. Ethan stood at the front, 29 years old, well-dressed, successful, and completely devastated. His father's death had been sudden. 3 days earlier, Daniel had suffered what doctors described as a catastrophic medical emergency. There had been no warning, no long illness, no final goodbye, just one phone call in the middle of the night. Ethan had arrived at the hospital too late. Now his father's coffin sat only a few feet away. Beside Ethan stood his father's lawyer, Richard Cole. Richard had worked for Daniel for more than 25 years. He had handled the family's legal affairs, business contracts, and private investments. He was the one person Ethan trusted to understand his father's complicated life. At least, he thought he did. The funeral director quietly approached Ethan. "We're ready." Ethan nodded. He stepped toward the coffin. Then he stopped. His hand rested against the polished wood. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," he whispered. Behind him, someone coughed. Ethan turned. An elderly man wearing a faded cemetery uniform was standing near the trees. He was holding a metal shovel. His name was Samuel Reed. He had worked at the cemetery for more than 20 years. Nobody paid much attention to him. He was simply the man who trimmed the grass, cleaned the paths, and prepared graves. But that morning, Samuel wasn't looking at the coffin. He was looking at Ethan. Their eyes met. Samuel slowly walked forward. Richard Cole frowned. "Samuel, this isn't the time." "I know," Samuel replied. Then he looked at Ethan. "Your father told me to wait." Ethan's expression changed. "What did you say?" Samuel reached inside his worn jacket. He removed a sealed envelope. Ethan immediately recognized his own name. Ethan Whitmore. And beneath it, "Do not open until he is dead." His fingers trembled. "Where did you get this?" "Your father gave it to me." "When?" Samuel looked toward the coffin. 20 years ago." Ethan stared at him. "That's impossible." Samuel didn't answer. Richard stepped forward. "Daniel never mentioned any letter." Samuel looked at him. "Your father told me you wouldn't know about it." Richard's face suddenly became serious. "Why?" "Because he didn't trust you." The words hit the funeral like a gunshot. Everyone went silent. Richard's expression hardened. "You'd better explain yourself." Samuel shook his head. "Not here." Ethan looked at the envelope. "Then where?" Samuel pointed toward the oldest section of the cemetery. "Come with me." Ethan hesitated. Then he looked at the coffin one last time and followed. Samuel led him through rows of ancient graves until they reached a small stone monument surrounded by overgrown trees. Ethan had never seen it before. The name on the gravestone made his stomach turn. Thomas Reed, born 1948, died 2006. Ethan looked at Samuel. "Who is Thomas Reed?" Samuel stared at the grave. "My father." Ethan frowned. "Then why have you been coming here every morning for 20 years?" Samuel's eyes filled with sadness. Because your father asked me to. Ethan stepped closer. What does my father's death have to do with your father? Samuel finally looked at him. Everything. He pointed toward the grave. Because your father told me that one day, his son would come looking for the truth. Ethan's heart began pounding. What truth? Samuel handed him a small brass key. That's what your father wanted you to find. Ethan looked at the key. There was a number engraved on it. 17. He turned toward Samuel. What's 17? Samuel pointed toward a row of old storage buildings behind the cemetery. Locker 17. They walked in silence. Inside the old cemetery maintenance building was a narrow corridor filled with dusty equipment and rusted metal lockers. Samuel stopped at number 17. Ethan inserted the key. The lock clicked. Inside was a small black box. No money. No jewelry. No business documents. Just an old photograph. Ethan picked it up. His hands immediately began shaking. The photograph showed his father 20 years younger. Standing beside him was Samuel. But they weren't alone. Between them stood a young woman holding a little boy. Ethan stared at the boy. He knew that face. It was his own. But the woman wasn't his mother. Who is she? Samuel didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said. Her name was Claire. Ethan's breathing stopped. My mother? No. She was your father's first wife. Ethan stared at him. First wife. My father never told me he was married before. Samuel shook his head. He wasn't supposed to. Ethan looked back at the photograph. If that's true, why did my father hide her? Samuel reached into the box again. There was another photograph. This one showed Daniel standing outside a hospital. Beside him was Claire. And in Daniel's arms was a newborn baby. Ethan's face went pale. That's me. Samuel nodded. Yes. Your father told everyone your mother died giving birth. Ethan stared at the photograph. But she didn't. No. She disappeared. Why? Samuel's voice became quiet. Because she discovered what your father had done. Ethan looked confused. What did he do? Samuel stared at the sealed envelope. That's what he wanted you to learn after his death. Ethan tore open the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter. The handwriting was unmistakably his father's. Ethan began reading. My son, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. There are things I should have told you years ago. I know you will hate me when you learn the truth. But I need you to understand one thing before you judge me. Everything I did because I believed I was protecting you. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. He continued. Your mother didn't die. She left. And I let everyone believe she was dead. 20 years ago, she discovered that my business partner was stealing millions from our company. She threatened to expose him. I tried to stop her. Not because I wanted to protect the thief. Because I knew what those men were capable of. They threatened you. They threatened her. And when she refused to stay quiet, I made the worst decision of my life. I sent her away. Ethan stopped reading. His hands shook. Where? Samuel answered. She was forced to leave the country. Your father arranged a new identity for her. Ethan looked at him in disbelief. Then why didn't she come back? Samuel's eyes dropped. Because your father told her that you would be safer without her. Ethan's face crumpled. He lied to her? Yes. And to me? Yes. Why? Samuel looked toward the old photograph. Because your father believed that if the men responsible ever discovered she was alive, they would come after you. Ethan sat down. For the first time that day, his grief was no longer only about losing his father. It was about discovering that his entire childhood had been built around a lie. But there was still one question. If my mother is alive, where is she? Samuel reached into the box. This time, he removed a second envelope. There was an address written across it. Ethan stared at the location. His hand stopped shaking. It was a small town only 2 hours away. She's there? Samuel nodded. She's been waiting. Ethan stood. Waiting for what? Samuel looked directly into his eyes. For you. Ethan immediately reached for his phone. Then Samuel grabbed his arm. There's something else. What? Your father wasn't the man who arranged your mother's disappearance. Ethan froze. What do you mean? Samuel looked toward the cemetery entrance. Someone else gave the order. Someone your father trusted. Ethan remembered Richard Cole, his father's lawyer. The man who had been standing beside the coffin. The man who had claimed to know everything about Daniel's affairs. The man who had just told everyone Daniel had died unexpectedly. Ethan's stomach tightened. Richard. Samuel nodded. Your father discovered the truth only months ago. He was preparing to expose him. That's why your father died. Ethan stared at Samuel. You think Richard killed him? I don't know. But your father was afraid. Afraid enough to prepare that letter. Ethan looked back toward the cemetery. His father's funeral was still taking place. And Richard Cole was still there. Waiting. Watching. Ethan suddenly understood why Daniel had written, "Do not open until he is dead." Because his father knew the truth would be dangerous while he was alive. But there was something Daniel hadn't known. Richard had already noticed that Ethan had left the funeral. And now, Richard was following them. Ethan and Samuel hurried back toward the cemetery. But when they reached the main path, Ethan stopped. Richard was standing beside his father's coffin. Alone. He was holding something in his hand. A photograph. Ethan recognized it immediately. It was the same photograph of Daniel, Claire, and the little boy. Richard slowly looked up. Their eyes met. For several seconds, neither man moved. Then Richard smiled. Not a friendly smile. A warning. You opened the letter. Ethan stepped forward. You knew? Richard sighed. I knew your father would eventually tell you. Where is my mother? Richard's expression changed. Still asking the wrong question. Ethan's voice became firm. Then give me the right one. Richard looked at the coffin. Ask yourself why your father needed a janitor to deliver his final message. Samuel stepped forward. Because he didn't trust you. Richard laughed softly. No, he didn't trust anyone. He looked at Ethan. Not even himself. Ethan's anger grew. What did you do to my father? Richard didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and removed a second letter. This was found in Daniel's safe. He held it up. It contains the name of the person who ordered your mother's disappearance. Ethan stared at it. Give it to me. Richard shook his head. You don't understand. Once you read this, your entire family will change forever. Ethan stepped closer. I've already lost my father. What else can you take from me? Richard's face became completely serious. Your mother. Silence. Ethan's heart stopped. What did you say? Richard slowly lowered the letter. She's alive. But she's not where Samuel thinks she is. Ethan stared at him. Where is she? Richard looked toward the old cemetery. Then toward the grave marked Thomas Reed. Finally, he whispered. She's been beneath this cemetery the entire time. Ethan's blood ran cold. Samuel turned pale. That's impossible. Richard shook his head. Not beneath the grave. Beneath the cemetery. He pointed toward an old stone building hidden behind the trees. There is a room under the original chapel. Your father built it 20 years ago. That's where he hid everything. The evidence. The money. The records. And the woman he told the world was dead. Ethan couldn't breathe. His mother had been alive all these years. And the answer had been sitting beneath the same cemetery his father had chosen for his funeral. Ethan looked at Samuel, then at Richard, then at his father's coffin. He finally understood the cruelest part of his father's final message. The funeral hadn't been the end of Daniel Whitmore's story. It had been the beginning of Ethan discovering the truth. Ethan walked toward the old chapel. Samuel followed. Richard remained behind. But before Ethan reached the door, his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then an elderly woman's trembling voice came through the phone. Ethan. His entire body froze. He knew that voice. He had heard it only once before. In a childhood, recording his father had forbidden him to listen to. Mom. Silence. Then she whispered. My son. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. Where are you? Her voice trembled. Don't trust the man who gave you the letter. Ethan slowly looked back. Richard was gone. The cemetery was suddenly silent. And then his mother said the words that changed everything. Your father didn't die. Ethan's heart stopped. What? He faked his death. Because he knew they were coming for you. The call ended. Ethan stood frozen beneath the rain. His father's coffin was still behind him. The funeral was still underway. But now he knew the truth. The man everyone believed was dead might still be alive. And if that was true, then the body inside the coffin belonged to someone else. Ethan turned slowly toward the grave. For 20 years, Samuel had visited one grave every morning. Not because his father was buried there. Not because Daniel was buried there. But because Daniel had used that grave to hide the first piece of a secret that was never supposed to be discovered. Ethan looked at the coffin, then at the old chapel, then at the empty space where Richard had been standing. His father had spent 20 years preparing him for this moment. And somewhere beneath the cemetery, the truth was waiting. Sometimes the biggest lies aren't created to destroy a family. Sometimes they're created to protect one. But protection can become its own prison. And sooner or later, Every hidden truth demands to be released. If this story kept you guessing, subscribe to Hidden Motives for more stories where the truth is never what it first appears to be. And now I want to know what you think. If you were Ethan, would you open the chapel and risk discovering the truth about your father? Or would you walk away and protect the last memories you had of him? Tell us in the comments. Because sometimes, the most dangerous secret isn't the one someone hides from you. It's the one they spend 20 years trying to protect you from.